Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at theological issues in Paul, his epistles. I'm calling this part two because last time we looked at Paul's theology. This time we're only looking at a few issues. Our textbook that we've been using covers quite a few others. I'm not going to rehash those, but I do want to look at several things that come to light. First of all, when we read Paul, notice I asked the question, so what? Actually, I think he causes us to ask the question whenever he teaches us something. He teaches us what Christians are called to believe. He also, and I think he does this in every case. I'm stepping out on a limb here. Sometimes there might be exceptions, but I'm going to say it that way anyway. And you'll see in a minute for a particular reason that he always addresses the question that we could ask. Okay, I believe that. So what? How do I live as a result? And so he not only tells us what Christians are called to believe, but how they are to live as a result of what they believe. And usually you can divide up Paul's epistles. There's one or two exceptions, but you can say, here's what Christians are called to believe. That's the first half of the epistle. Think of Ephesians, for example, or Colossians does the same thing, or Romans. And then the last half of the epistle, how are they called to live as a result of what they believe? So that's going to be a very common outline for Paul's epistles. Now, our textbook makes the distinction between ethics versus ethos. Ethics are those moral principles that are used as guidelines for action, as opposed to ethos speaks of the character and attitudes that lead people in their actions, sometimes based on ethics, but sometimes just based upon who they are. And the illustration they use, and I've used this countless times myself, when our daughter was a little girl. She would say, well, why can't I do this or that? All my friends are doing it. And sometimes we would say, well, that's not right. But other times we would say, because that's not what we do. We're Stevensons, and that means something, and we don't do it that way. And so sometimes it would be an ethical issue, sometimes it would be an ethos issue, and sometimes it would be sort of both wrapped up together. And we see the same thing in the New Testament. So ethics tend to be external. Now, you might hold the ethics for internal reasons, but what you do about them, that's external. Ethos tends to be more internal because that's just how you are. It's who and what you are. In ethics, those are stipulations about what should or should not be done in particular situations or in the face of particular issues. When we come to ethos, that's the atmosphere that operates within a group, informing the character of its corporate life, how they are, not necessarily that they're choosing, although I think there is a choice involved, but mostly because that's the identity of who they are and what they're like, and they make decisions out of that. Next, I want to move and talk, and this is a bit unrelated, I suppose, but I want to talk about leadership in the church. And in particular, we're looking at what Paul has to say about leadership in the church. As Paul first comes to the church, and remember, he wasn't, he didn't become a believer on the day of Pentecost. So the church actually predated Paul in that sense. The church following Jesus, the Jesus followers, he had been antagonistic to that. But as the church was first formed, it already had what we could call church officers in the form of apostles. The term apostle, and actually, it's our English word is taken from a Greek word apostolos, which sounds an awful lot like apostle because that's where we get our word. And the apo part is from, and cello, the rest of the word, means to send. So it's somebody who is sent out from someone else. But the term tends to carry the idea of authority. So someone who's sent out, but sent out with authority. And as I said, Jesus had chosen 12, not just disciples, he had many disciples. He had chosen 12 apostles. And of those 12, remember how that you'd had Judas Iscariot, who had fallen by the wayside, who would betray Jesus. But then in Acts chapter 1, the church had moved to appoint a replacement for Judas, a replacement to his office. And that's why we are describing this as a church office. And indeed, they chose up two candidates, both of apparently who had seen the risen Jesus, and one of them, Mattathias, was actually chosen They cast lots. It's funny because I can't think of too many churches these days that chooses their leadership. Maybe they've got two candidates, but that chooses it by casting lots. And I'm not saying we should, but that is how they did that in Acts chapter 1. And that was to let to give room and also understanding that it's Jesus who is the one. The Lord is the one who chooses the leadership. That was the idea behind the casting of lots, to leave it up to the Lord to do that. Now, Paul, speaking of the apostles, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he talks about how Jesus was raised on the third day, and a few verses later, he says he's talking about his different appearances, post-resurrection appearances, and that he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles. And you say, well, does that mean that James was one of these apostles, or he just appeared to James, and then he appeared to the apostles, but not to James? It's not entirely clear. Although remember, James, the Lord's brother, is going to have considerable authority. But the point here isn't so much about James. The point here is that the apostles were those who had seen the risen Jesus, at least the apostles when we talk about the 11 or the 12. In that sense, they were people that had seen the risen Jesus. But remember, it was already a Greek word that had been coined long before there were 12 apostles. So you could use it in that very specific sense, or you could use it in a more general sense. The same term could be used either way. Galatians chapter 1 and verse 19, Paul is talking about his various trips to Jerusalem, and he had come to Jerusalem and stayed there for 15 days. And he said, I did not see any other of the apostles except James, the Lord's brother. And again, here, James, this time it seems, is being numbered with the apostles, although he's not one of the 12. He's not one of the 11 or the 12th who had been voted on. He's not one of those, but he still seems to be described in some sense as an apostle by Paul. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 5 and 6, Paul said he's speaking about his ministry. Both he and Silas had done ministry there in Thessalonica. He says, nor do we seek glory from men, either from you or from others, even though as apostles of Christ we might have asserted our authority. So notice Paul, both here and in other places, describes himself as an apostle, and then to back that up, he talks about how he had actually seen the risen Jesus. But not only Paul, notice as he's describing himself in the plural, not that Paul is a plural, but there are others with him, and the one that had been with him had been Silas. Now, had Silas ever seen the risen Jesus, or is he an apostle more in the sense of having been sent out by the church to found other churches? You see, that might be a more general sense in which Silas's apostleship is described as such. And then finally, 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 7, Paul says, I was appointed a preacher and an apostle. He gives almost like a footnote. I'm telling the truth. I'm not lying. As a teacher of the Gentiles in faith and in truth. So that his apostleship was directed more toward the Gentiles. He was sent out primarily to do ministry toward the Gentiles. That doesn't mean he didn't do any ministry toward the Jews. He did. He would frequently, in fact, almost regularly, he would go into a city and first look up the synagogue and speak to them about Jesus as the Messiah. But then he would branch out and go and speak to the Gentiles. And this was his apostleship. Ephesians chapter 4:11, and these are all passages we've looked at already earlier on our course, but Paul says he gives some as apostles. Now, this isn't talking necessarily about the church offices, but he's just talked about how Christ rose and he gave gifts to men, and he gave as these gifts, some as apostles, some as prophets, some as evangelists, and some as pastors and teachers. And notice he had said in each case, and the Greek is properly translated here in our translation, some as, until he gets to pastors, and then he doesn't say, and some as teachers, he just says, as pastors and teachers. So he comes to those and seems to group those two together, so that you have apostles and prophets, evangelists. I take evangelists to refer to what we could call gospelizers, people that are taking the gospel to new places. Well, apostles do that as well. Prophets have a tendency, I guess they can speak to both unbelievers and believers, but they have a pronouncement gift that's slightly different. So there are perhaps nuances between these. And then the word pastor, actually, the Greek word there is just the word shepherd. But we have taken that word and we've think about a pastoral setting. I guess you could talk about a church like that, or you could think about shepherds who are pastoring. They're taking their sheep out to pasture, out to the fields and so on. And so the term has two meanings, both our term, but also their term. And so a shepherd, but in this case, it's a spiritual shepherd instead of a physical shepherd. But the word was the same for either case. So when we come to church offices, one of those church offices, and I'm bypassing apostle right now, the term overseer. Philippians chapter 1 and verse 1, we read Paul and Timothy, bondservants of Christ Jesus. By the way, that's not the word deacon. It's not that's a servant too, but this is just the basic word for slave. Slaves of Christ Jesus, to all the saints in Christ Jesus who are in Philippi, including here, and here it is, the overseers and deacons. Now notice the plural in both cases. It's not the overseer and deacons. It's not the pastor, like one guy and then the deacons, but instead it's the overseers plural and the deacons plural, so that you have described in Philippians. And incidentally, this passage bothers some people, and for that reason, and really that reason alone, they have said, well, Paul must not have written that because we don't think that Paul had that theology, and we think that's from a later age. But that's just trying to base your image of Paul instead of what Paul's really saying. So no, he talked in his day about in Philippi they were both overseers and deacons, and they are the two branches of leadership. Remember, the word deacon means servant, different word from the word for pastor, but it one who serves. But this seems to be used not just those who are serving generally, but it seems to be used in the sense of church offices. 1 Timothy chapter 3, this is, remember, one of the pastoral epistles. Both 1 Timothy 3 and Titus chapter 1 are the two passages that give these quite lengthy descriptions of certain offices in the church. In this case, he starts off chapter 3, verse 1. It is a trustworthy statement. If any man aspires to the office of overseer, it is a fine work he desires to do. An overseer, then, and the Greek word, that's exactly what it means to oversee. Episkopos is the Greek word. Epi is like over, and then to scope out something is to look at it, like when you look at a telescope. So an overseer is quite literal. And an overseer must be above reproach, and he continues on from there to describe the qualifications, the character qualities, actually, of what an overseer would look like. And then Titus chapter 1, verses 5 through 7, this is the parallel passage to 1 Timothy. Paul says to Titus, for this reason I left you in Crete, and he talks about to set in order what remains. But then he goes on to appoint elders in every city as I directed you, namely, if any man is above reproach, and he begins to describe those character qualities. But then he comes to verse 7, for the overseer must be above reproach as God's steward. Now, there have been some who have said, well, that's two different offices. You had the elders, plural, and you have the overseer, singular. But I think it's more likely, and I'm not going to be dogmatic, but it sounds like, especially when I look at Paul's words earlier to Philippians, it sounds like these are two different titles for what is essentially the same office. So that the elder, and the word elder just means elder, it means somebody who's older. You say it in the plural, it's presbyteroi. The oi is plural, presbyteroi. We get our word Presbyterian from that. The Presbyterian Church is a denomination of churches that have elders in their church offices. That's their sort of their claim to fame. There's lots of other churches that do as well, so it's not too much of a claim to fame, but that's where the title comes from. So they are to appoint presbytoi or elders in every city, and then he goes on, for the overseer must be above reproach. Now, are these two separate offices or are they one office? Let me just say this. By the time we get to the second century AD, early second century, we have some letters written by one of the overseers. Actually, he is the overseer at the church of Antioch in his day. And he describes how he's an overseer, but there were also elders and there were also deacons. So by his day, and he's not saying, let's do it this way from now on, he's just describing what already is. So within a couple of generations of Paul having written these words, the early church now had an overseer. If you want to call him a bishop, that's okay. That's an English word that went through a long transition to get there. A bishop or overseer, and then there would also be elders, and then there would also be deacons. So notice that by the second century, we have three church offices. I would suggest that in Paul's day, at least what Paul describes clearly, would be two. I don't think there's necessarily three, but two church offices. And the first one is overseers. The second one would be elders. Notice I'm taking these as two different titles for the same office, not two different offices. Um, 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 17. In addition to what we saw in 1 Timothy chapter 3, by the way, if there are no elders in 1 Timothy 3, he only uses the term overseers. He doesn't use the term elder there. But when we get to chapter 5, he talks about the elders who rule well are to be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who work hard at preaching and teaching. Notice that there were some of the elders who would rule well and would be considered worthy of double honor, specifically or especially those who are preaching and teaching, and other elders might not be doing that specific function. So it could be that I could actually have elders that are working hard at preaching and teaching and elders that are doing other eldering duties. Still okay, but that's not their primary ministry. We jump down to verse 19. Paul says, do not receive an accusation against an elder. Now, here he doesn't differentiate between two different kinds of an elder, but he says, do not receive an accusation against an elder except on the basis of two or three witnesses. That is, don't let your leadership be slandered, unless there are actual witnesses, just not on one person's hearsay or say so, because that might be somebody who is just giving a false report. This was actually a very Jewish idea. The law actually had said, let everything be established in the presence of two or three witnesses. And so notice how the law carries over in this case, and Paul actually applies that to this situation. In Acts chapter 20, and this isn't something Paul wrote, but he was there, so I'm going to cite it. Remember in the story where Paul is headed to Jerusalem and he stops off at Miletus, and from there he sent to Ephesus and called to him the elders of the church. And when they get there, he speaks at length to them, and as he speaks to them, verse 28, he says, be on guard for yourselves and for all the flock among which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers. Now that's plural again. Now, they were elders, so they had the church office. Did they also have the office of overseer, or is this just a functionary part of what elders do? And notice it's you overseers to shepherd, or we could say to pastor the church of God, which he purchased with his own blood. So it's elders that are the church offices in that situation. Next, I want to talk about the issue of leadership as it relates to gender. Now, there are those who have said, well, gender shouldn't be an issue when it comes to choosing leaders in the church, elders, overseers, deacons, apostles, any of that. And part of this is when we read Paul in Galatians chapter 3 and verse 28, he says, well, in Christ you are neither Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male or female. And so it is claimed, therefore, we should not worry about whether a pastor or a leader, an overseer, an elder, or a deacon is male or female, because that doesn't exist. And I said, well, it does exist because Paul goes on to give instructions to men and to women, to older men, to older women, to younger men, to younger women. And so you can't just say it doesn't exist because he doesn't treat it as though it doesn't exist. I think it exists with regard to marriage, that within the scriptures it's quite clear that men are supposed to be marrying women, not men marrying men or women marrying women. That sort of thing doesn't exist within the confines of the church. The church knows nothing of those sorts of arrangements, even though there are societies that have sought to legalize and to normalize those sorts of choices. Um, it's also true that when we look at Ephesians chapter 5, now this is leading up to one of those sections that give instructions to women and then to men and then to children and fathers and slaves and masters and so on, every area of society, that begins in chapter 5, verse 21 of Ephesians, uh, for a call to submit to one another. And so, see, we're to be submitting one to another, and then it actually goes on to say, um, uh, "Wives to your husbands," and that's one example. Or husbands, the way you love your wives. Or children, obey your parents, and or fathers, don't exasperate your children. And he takes it from there. And it's true. By the way, that's a true statement that there is a sense in which we are all to be in a submission to one another, and I would say that even applies to leaders, that leaders are called also not to lord it over those over whom they have charge, but that they are to be servant leaders, that they are, in that sense, to serve, to be submitting to the needs of those within their assemblies, those within their churches. But that doesn't negate any sort of gender issues. That really doesn't address that with regard to gender issues in leadership. Now, another example that's used, Priscilla and Aquila, Acts chapter 18 and verse 26, where they take, and it doesn't say just that Aquila does this, both Aquila and Priscilla, and whenever you see the two of them together, they are a husband and wife team, a Jewish team that had come from Italy and then linked up with Paul and became his co-laborers. That sometimes Aquila is mentioned first, sometimes Priscilla is, and it's interesting to note that. I suppose the same thing happens with my wife and I. Sometimes somebody might speak of Paula and John, or somebody might speak of John and Paula, and depending on the context or just whichever name happens to come up, not sure that anything in particular is meant by it. But both Priscilla and Aquila take young Apollos. Apollos was a brand new Christian. He was very eloquent, great rhetorician. He was convincing. He was pleasing. He knew how to speak, and he was telling people about the Lord. Except that he didn't have he didn't have all that much knowledge. He had some. I don't want to put him down because not everything had been revealed yet. He had heard about the coming Messiah, and he'd heard about John the Baptist, and he'd heard about baptism and repentance. But the part about Jesus, death, burial, and resurrection, he hadn't been brought up to speed on that. And so they both took him. Priscilla and Aquila take him, and they further educate him in the way of Christianity. And notice it's not just Aquila doing it. It's this husband and wife team that were both involved in that. And I think that's a good point, and that maybe helps us to understand some of the things that both men and women are called to do. Now, let me just say a bit of practical advice. I think it can be a bit dangerous for a woman to try to disciple a man. But a husband and wife team, or if you want to call it the wife and husband team, a team doing that, I think negates some of those risky temptations that might arise. And so I think there's a wonderful pattern here that takes place in Acts 18:26. Now, there's also the example of Phoebe. Phoebe is mentioned in Romans chapter 16 and verse 1, and she is described as one who had served the church. Um, this is Paul giving commendations to, he begins with Phoebe. He's going to commend a number of different people. And he mentions her, he says, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, who is a servant. And the word servant there, it's not the word for slave, not doulos, but diakonos, a deacon, if we want to call it that, of the church, which is at Kenkrea, Now, Cenchrea was this little tiny port town. It was a suburb of Corinth, within walking distance of Corinth. But Corinth had two ports, one on either side of the isthmus, and this was one of them. And notice he goes on to say that you receive her in the Lord in a manner worthy of the saints, that you help her in whatever manner she may have need of you. We don't know what manner that is. Paul doesn't really tell us. For she herself has also been a helper of many and of myself as well. So she had been a helper, but also notice a servant slash deacon. Does this mean that she held the position of deacon, or did she just serve? And Paul's words aren't that clear where we can make a determination either way. So Phoebe is sometimes held up as an example of a deaconess, and perhaps that's allowed by the passage, but that is not definitive. It's interesting to note, by the way, that your first deacon seemed to be in Acts chapter 6. Remember the instance where there were widows who were being overlooked. So women's ministry. If ever you were expecting to see women deacons, it would be heading up women's ministries. But instead, in that case, there were 7 men that were chosen. Now you say, well, that was just the church being sort of sexist, and I'll grant that maybe that's the case, but that never seems to be corrected in a specific statement. So maybe Phoebe was a deaconess, but maybe not. Maybe she was just one who had served the church, and either one, we commend her in a good way. There is also the instance of 1 Corinthians chapter 11 that speaks of those who are praying or prophesying, and specifically talks about women who are doing this. When a woman prays or prophesies, but then the issue, Paul says, she should have her head covered when she does that. And really the bigger thing that he's bringing up isn't whether women are allowed to pray or prophesy. He's just assuming that they are, but that they should have a some sort of covering in place to show what? To show their proper place, because it is good and acceptable. And we're going to come back and look at some of the reasons that he mentions. He doesn't say this is for cultural reasons. This is so that you can fit into the secular culture of your day. He doesn't actually say that. He's going to give entirely different reasons. Now, there are a number of passages that point us in the direction of male leadership, and I want to look at those. First of all, Paul states in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 12, we've already read this when we were looking through Timothy, but he says in verse 12, I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet. So notice, not only does he say what he does not allow, but then what she should do. And so it's, notice, not teaching or exercise authority, but to remain quiet. And that plays into the previous verse 11, a woman must quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness. So you have that submissive idea connected to that. Now, you might say, well, that's just talking about wives. And I say, well, okay, well, does that mean single women have certain rights, but that married people don't? I'm not sure that the passage is really stating that. And the context goes on to deal with that. But then, of course, the question that we'll ask, and we'll come back to it, is that just something that Timothy was being instructed to do in his particular church, or was this a universal practice? We'll come back and ask that question. Secondly, we already cited 1 Corinthians chapter 11 that talked about male headship in corporate worship, as seen by the fact that women were called to be veiled. He goes on to say that's not appropriate for men. It's interesting. If you go to a Jewish synagogue today, the practice is for men to have a covering on their head. That's become the practice that apparently wasn't back in Paul's day, but it has become it was a practice that was instituted at a later date. And then there is Paul's instruction in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 32, women keep silence in the church. Now remember, he's already talked about women praying and prophesying in 1 Corinthians 11. So This would necessarily not be without exceptions, and we're going to come to that next. That even though a statement like this is made, I'm calling for women to be silent in the church, and yet he's already noted the exceptions to the rule. Now, first, before we get to the exceptions, let's ask the question: are these teachings, are these instructions regarding women local, or are they universal? Are they just for that particular church at that time? Are they for that particular era at that time because of the cultural and societal norms of the day? Or are they universal principles that are to be followed by Christians of every age? We could ask it this way: are they principles or are they uh, ethos? Um, are they ethics or ethos? Which way are we to turn? And to answer that, I think it's helpful to go back and look at the reasons. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, this is the passage that talks about a woman being veiled as she prays or prophesies, so it does allow that. One of the reasons that Paul gives, in fact, the only clear reason that he gives, is because of the angels. Now, let me submit that angels aren't necessarily cultural, that angels maybe have a larger view than just what's appropriate in the first century AD. That if it's because of the angels, then that's pointing to something that is more general, more universal than just a localized application. Secondly, he says, now this is in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 34. He's explaining why women are called to be silent in the church. He says, because the law also says. Now, he doesn't quote where in the law it says that. So that may be a little bit problematic to understand exactly where that's coming from. Of course, as I look at the law and the instructions that were given in the Torah, I can see a number of cases where there were elders that were assigned over the families and the tribes, and the norm, at least, I don't know if there were exceptions to this, but the norm was that they were the husbands, they were the men. I think there may have been exceptions. What happens if somebody was widowed, and if there was a widow involved, or we're going to come back and ask, well, what about people like Deborah, who was a judge, and yet she was a woman? I think there were some exceptions, and so we'll come back and address that. But because the law also says, uh, again, that's more than just first century. You might say, well, that's ancient times. These are modern times, and that would be a true statement. I'm not saying that this was written in the 21st century. It was written many hundreds, 2,000 years ago. Because of the order of creation, Paul cites in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 13. He says, I don't allow a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet, for it was Adam who was first created and then Eve. Well, that sounds much more like a universal principle when it's based on the order of creation. That really has nothing to do with what happened in the first century or societal norms in Greece, Rome, or even Israel. So because of the order of creation, and then in the next verse he says, because of the sequence of the fall, because he goes on to say, and it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. Now he doesn't conclude from that women are more easily deceived. He's not making that sort of statement. If you want to read into that, that's okay, but that's not what's clearly stated, at least. And then let me suggest, all of these were written by Paul, but let me also just suggest something that's sort of obvious. As Paul comes onto the scene, I don't think he's the one who's inventing this. The pattern established by Jesus, if you look at his apostles, he did not choose 6 men and 6 women to be apostles. You say, well, didn't he have women involved in his ministry? Absolutely. Yes, there were women both who served in a support role, those that gave financially, those that seemed to have been there to do other things. I look at Mary Magdalene. Certainly, she's the first one who sees the risen Jesus and takes the word back to the apostles. So, don't want to downplay her role at all, but she was not appointed by Jesus to be one of the apostles. And it just so happens that Jesus appointed 12 men to be apostles. And so the early church took that, I think, and ran with it. I think appropriately. You might say, you might disagree with that, but be careful because you might be disagreeing with what Jesus did. Now, this brings up the final question: is this a general rule, or are there exceptions? So the general versus the exceptional. I think this is at least a rule. I think we can see that, and Paul expresses it as such. Jesus set the stage for it as such. And yet, we just noted in the Old Testament, we have certain exceptions. We have prophets generally as men, but we can think of Huldah the prophetess. We look at judges generally men, but there's Deborah who was a judge, although a woman. And so there are times where, because of the need of the hour or maybe other circumstances, where the general rule is put aside because of the exception. And I can look at the Old Testament. I can perhaps look at places in the New Testament. Now, I'm not sure if Phoebe's an example because we don't have enough to go on there. But I can think of other times where a general statement is used, and yet there are exceptions to the general statement. For example, when Jesus says that once you are married, and that anyone who is divorced and marries another is committing adultery. And that's the way it's very clearly stated in one of the Gospels. But then you turn to its counterpart in another one of the Gospel accounts, and you have the exception mentioned, which is not mentioned in the first one. And the exception is except in cases of adultery. In other words, if there had been an innocent party, that party is not bound. And Paul actually explains this later on in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, the exception to the rule. So you could have a rule, and yet there would be exceptions to the rule. Now, I think we need to be careful to not let the exceptions become the new rule, but to still see that sometimes there are exceptional exceptions, and that's okay. And and I've seen firsthand sometimes where, in the case of church leadership, since that's our subject, where there has been leadership either in a church or other Christian institution, and there was not a qualified man to come and pick up the reins. And when a woman did it, and I think it was appropriate, now might be going out on a limb here, but I think it was an exception to the general rule. Doesn't mean we toss out the general rule, but that we recognize that sometimes exceptions take place.